Yo, what's up guys, I'm Dunmere. I'm a rank 1 peak Supervive player and I have almost 1,000 hours played in the game so far. So with that, I went ahead and put together a myth guide for you guys. Now, in the myth guide, I do call her Huntress. That was her old name, but of course everything is unchanged and the information is still completely legitimate. So go ahead and enjoy the video, guys. Let's look at Huntress's strengths and weaknesses. Huntress's first core strength is her amazing ranged pressure. Her primary fire's range is top tier in Supervive, so she has an incredibly impressive ability to beat enemies at distance. This isn't all though, as her stun arrow and AoE damage zone also have impressive range, so she doesn't need to risk getting close to use these either. And to add even more on top of both of these, she also has her ultimate ability with even longer range. Her damage and utility is reliable in these abilities also, and they don't have fall off, so she can take quite effective advantage of the range she has. For Huntress's second core strength, she has great mobility and escape utility. Not only does she have 2 dodge roll charges that she can use to dodge enemy damage or abilities, but she can also use these dodge rolls for ghost walk. With this, she can easily push through walls into locations enemies won't expect, or use her wall walkthrough to escape when pressured. With this ability, she's simply capable of outmaneuvering almost every character in the game, and can easily use this to escape enemy chasers, so she can go to resurrect her team when losing a fight. Though Huntress is quite powerful in these areas, she still does have some nuanced weaknesses. The first of these is that Huntress's value output is inconsistent compared to other ranged characters in the roster. She lacks as strong of an ability to pressure enemies through walls as other characters. She can use her rain of arrows to deal some damage to them, but doesn't have a hard stun or massive damage that some other characters have. This means that despite her ranged damage, her value output can be heavily hampered when enemies can reliably use cover or pressure from the opposite side of cover. She can use Ghost Walk to move through these walls, but risk being caught out when doing so. This leads into her second weakness of being vulnerable at close range. Huntress's bow requires her to slow down a lot when using it, which makes her quite vulnerable to enemy abilities and damage. Yet if she wants to get value, she's often forced to try to compensate for her inability to hard threaten enemies through walls by moving around cover or using Ghost Walk as mentioned to walk through that cover. Either way, Huntress risks being caught at close range by an enemy using that cover, and likely losing the exchange after. She also can have her Ghost Walk cancelled by enemies, so she's even more at risk of being unable to escape from them if they're pumping her with damage. So with the strengths and weaknesses covered, let's talk about how to actually play Huntress. As a high range and primary fire based character, Huntress gets the most value by playing to keep her enemies at her max range and continuously burn them down over time with arrows. This means her other cooldowns are best used to support this playstyle, such as doing things like holding her dashes and knockback so she can safely play for aggressive side angles, or manipulating enemies into her sightlines with her AoE zoning damage. Sometimes, Huntress will struggle to get good vision on the enemies, but she just needs to play consistently to stay alive and the opportunities will come to her. So with that strategy overview, let's get into some more specifics for her abilities. Huntress's primary fire bow has 3 different versions of its attack, meaning it has 3 different use cases. Its unempowered version is very low damage per second compared to the empowered and supercharged versions, so it's only really useful to finish off a target. However, the use of its empowered and supercharged versions gets more interesting. While the supercharged version starts off as the highest damage output, it becomes significantly lower total DPS after using the first one right as it reaches empowered or supercharged state. This is because Huntress then enters the flow state, and the empowered shots charge much faster, but the supercharged shots stay the same total charge time. This lets you use the flow state empowered shots for max damage output, such as to burn down a stun target, while also not having to be slow moving while drawing the arrow as long, which allows her to dodge more enemy damage in a 1v1. The total range on empowered shots is still a lot shorter than supercharged arrows though, so it isn't objectively better. This means that while flow state empowered shots are best for close range fighting, supercharged shots are what you should default to until you're safe enough to get close to enemies, or until one just jumps onto you. As for Huntress's range stun, it is a quite powerful ability with both offensive and defensive use cases. It has great combat value as it can be used to just knock enemies back that get too close to her, but can also be used specifically for its stun by knocking enemies back into a wall and then following it up with damage. Huntress can also use her stun arrow while channeling her ultimate, so you can combo the two for an even more powerful stun and then ultimate follow-up. Alternatively, the knockback arrow can even be used to push back wisps, which you could use to push an ally wisp to an easier resurrection spot, or knock an enemy wisp away from an easy res or off the map to their death. For Huntress's Ghost Walk dash, there is quite a bit of nuance in what it can do. Though she has 2 dash charges, they don't each have a separate cooldown timer, but are actually on the same timer. This means that Huntress will recover any lost dashes when the cooldown timer is over, but also means that using her second dash will cause the cooldown timer to reset even if she almost had her first dash available again. So Huntress can have the highest amount of dash uses by spamming both together whenever she uses one, but this doesn't necessarily mean she'll get the most value out of it. While she will have the most total dashes this way, it also means she'll be full committing with every cycle like this, and wouldn't have the extra dash to protect herself if she needed it. So when using her dashes, you'll get a lot of value by carefully deciding between max uptime and flexibility depending on the situation. In terms of actual use cases, Huntress's dash is of course very useful for combat value, dodging enemy abilities, fighting enemies, chasing enemies, etc. But the dashes also have interesting utility on top of this, as they can be used to ferry allies through walls. Just keep in mind that enemies can also take portals that Huntress makes, so you should be careful of this when trying to escape from one. In regards to Huntress's AoE rain of arrows, it allows for solid damage into a group of enemies. but will supply a lot of other value in how it can be used to manipulate your enemy's positioning. Directly, it can be used to stop enemies from taking a location freely, such as by putting it in an area enemies are being forced into, or using it to mark an enemy off a side angle. But it can also be placed at your own feet to fend off potential divers, or tossed where Huntress wants to go, and used as a form of soft cover that enemies will struggle to push into. Indirectly, there's a lot of value in placing it behind enemies to cut off areas where they can play at also. In addition to both of these, it can simply be casted on top of an enemy wisp to apply the cremation effect. This is especially valuable if Huntress wouldn't otherwise be able to stop the enemy from rezzing that wisp, as cremation makes the res time significantly longer, and likely too long for any enemy to keep standing on it without getting punished. Moving on to Huntress's ultimate, it has two dimensions to its value. In the first dimension, it can be used for numerous things, like for its extra damage to burst down a solo target, for its extra range to catch a fleeing enemy, for its ability to cleave against lined up enemies, or even for its explosive damage into groups. Yet its second dimension is its potential in comboing with other abilities, as they can also be used while the ultimate is in use. Of course, it can be comboed with Huntress's AoE range of arrows to make enemies move into her sightlines, but gains even more potential damage capability with her stun arrow, as it allows a guaranteed follow-up ultimate shot. You shouldn't waste your first 2 ultimate arrows to get this, but if you do get the opportunity, it could even result in multiple kills if your stun hits more than one enemy. The time frame to use all 3 of Huntress's arrows is only around 6 seconds, but this is still enough time for some flexibility. With the specifics covered, let's talk about how to apply this into a full playstyle. As mentioned before, Huntress is all about maximizing the time she can spend pumping damage into enemies, specifically where she has sightlines on enemies that are outside of their range but still in hers. But how is this actually accomplished? In a vacuum, this would just be by sitting back and chunking enemies as they try to close a distance on her. However, the map geometry of the game is much more complex than this, so it requires more sophisticated strategy. So when not in a very open area, the most fundamental strategy you can do on Huntress is to off-angle and flank the enemy, which quickly explained is to just move away from your team until you can see the side of the enemy. Going just a bit to the side of the enemy team is called an off-angle. Going completely to the side is flanking. These both allow Huntress to bypass the enemy's cover and produce an extra angle of pressure on the enemies. And since her enemies can't just change their position easily to avoid an off-angling or flanking Huntress either, as doing so would expose her to the rest of her team, this forces the enemy into a rough situation. Either they sit around and get punished, or they must take action into one of 3 difficult counter attempts. Of course, Huntress can then attempt to counter their counter. This is what Huntress's gameplay is based around, playing for the off-angle or flank and then countering what the enemy does. So in the rest of this guide, I'll explain how you should play for off-angles and flanks on Huntress, and then how you counter the enemy response to each of these 3 options. Alright, so how should you off-angle and flank? Well, off-angling and flanking is really just walking away from your team and towards the enemy's side. You risk your life the more you do so. The further you get away from your team, the less they can help you if you get pressured. And the more you hunt for a good side angle, the more you risk being caught by an enemy that you couldn't see, though you should do so cautiously. This means that you should hold on to both of your dashes if you don't know where all the enemies are, and you should definitely save your knockback arrow also, as both of these will help you in a pinch. This becomes even more so true the further you stray from your team. You also want to be very careful when swinging around corners, as these are where enemies might be hiding at. This means that you're most at risk to get caught by an enemy's stun and burned when swinging, or if you get caught out by an enemy with similar or higher movement, you won't have an extra cushion of distance to get away with. The vision system in this game plays a heavy role in this also, since it allows enemies to see you when they normally couldn't, if one or more of their teammates can see you. So when looking to swing a corner, you should think about if there's any enemy you don't know where they are, and if any of the enemy's team has sight on you. If they do, then you should assume that the missing enemy is waiting to surprise you around the corner. You can still go around the corner, but this just means you should swing wider out around it and prepare to be attacked. Sure, it takes more time to do this, but it will give you that extra bit of distance to avoid a stun, knockback arrow a diver, or escape from someone chasing you just in case. More so, the vision system is important when considering how far you can go from your team. While the farther you go will usually mean the enemies will have even less cover, or won't have a location to escape to between you and your team, it also raises your own risk. So if nobody on the enemy team can see you doing this, then you can consider going for a hard flank. But if one can, they all can. So it's best to assume they're watching for you, and play for a more consistent and safer angle. So with the value and basics of off-angling and flanking established, let's talk about how off-angling and flanking relates to the enemy's options, and how Huntress can then counter them. Starting with the most simple of the enemy's options, we have the first, which is the enemy fully backing up and disengaging to escape the off-angle or flank. While this is the most neutral of the options, it may not even be possible in many situations due to the game being a battle royale, and otherwise often means the enemy is giving up some advantage to do so, such as a resource or positional advantage. Huntress's counterplay to this is just continuing to control the flank angle and to go for what she wants. If the enemy gives up a powerful location, then you take it. If they stop contesting a boss mob or some other advantage, you take it. Just always be watching for them sneaking back in when they think you aren't paying attention. Alternatively, if they can't back up but try anyway, you just push them and then punish their hesitation. Simply enough, you just win in the situation. Either you get a nice advantage or you're not worse off. The second option that enemies have is to send one of their allies to contest you. This is what will happen most commonly, though how you should react depends on what they send at you and what kind of distance your off angle or flank gives you. Your first goal is just to get free damage while you can and chunk arrows at them until they can actually threaten you. This time period may be a long time if they're relatively short range, low mobility, or you have a long distance from them, but may alternatively be a short time if they have high mobility, long range, or there isn't much space between you. Once the enemy can threaten you though, you need to play for two strategies. If the enemy has very high mobility and will beat you when close, you need to stay at range where you can still damage them, but can escape their max mobility range with your own dashes. You want to primary fire them during this, while waiting for them to jump you. Your goal is to either kill them during their hesitation, or dash away when they jump at you and then burst them with their stun. Then, you can pursue them with their low HP, continue kiting them backwards if you're still roughly even, or just outright escape if they damage you too much. Either way, your priority is your own life. So while you want things to go longer so you have more time to shoot at the enemy, you're also just trading your time for one of the enemy's time. This means your team isn't losing anything compared to the enemy team, while you're still playing towards the strategy that you want to. Alternatively, if the enemy they send to contest you just wants to damage you from range, you should look to bully them with your damaging abilities, either by stumming them into a wall so that you can win the 1v1, or forcing them to take damage with your rain of arrows. Just keep in mind that every enemy in this game has some form of movement to chase you down with, so it's still important to keep a distance you can escape at if the fight isn't heavily in your favor. Now to the third enemy option, which is a larger team engagement. Alternatively to just sending 1 or 2 enemies to target Huntress, an enemy team can fully send all 4 members onto Huntress to try and catch her out, or fully send onto her team instead to try and kill her team 4v3, before she can get back to the flank to help them. Enemies can only really do this while Huntress is fully flanking, versus when she's only off-angling though, as she won't be far enough from her team when not fully flanking. So when you do start to flank and go far enough from your team that they wouldn't be able to attack the enemy if they jumped on you, this is when you need to be careful. The key to countering both forms of an enemy team full sending is how you space yourself out from the enemy, and then how you use your movement ability. You essentially just always want to be within your max range of the enemy team, while saving your dashes. This way, if they full send onto you, they'll have to use all their movement to cover your max range, and then you'll have your dashes to get that max range distance back where you can shoot them for free. And similarly, you need to save your dashes to get back in max range of an enemy team if they turn on your team instead, or they'll be fighting 4 enemies without you. It sounds simple enough, but when getting full sent on, you just need to live long enough for your team to collapse on the enemy and punish them, and if they chase your team instead, you need to be very responsive to pushing back into the enemy. Just because the enemy isn't attacking you doesn't mean your team isn't at risk of losing, so any seconds you don't have an enemy you can shoot at is time they might be crushing your team instead. Moreover, enemies may also try and full send your team if they forced you away in a 1v1, so it's extremely important to communicate to your team if you're forced out of a fight for any reason. Maybe you lost a 1v1, or survived a bunch of enemies chasing you. Regardless, you need to tell your team what's going on and how long until you can fight again, so they can play more conservatively until you're ready to fight also. Similarly, even if you're forced away, you need to try and stay close as you can while you heal up. This way enemies still know you're a threat and don't push as aggressively into the rest of your team. Just make sure that during any time in these situations you're off-angling or flanking, that you're routinely checking around you for third parties coming in. This is a battle royale after all, and everything you've done in a team fight may go to nothing if you get caught out.